John did. Okay, well, I'm going to fill in here. I haven't actually looked at this in like 2 months, so I'll fill in for one of our fellows who can't be here. So it's going to be a little jumpy here because, like I said, I haven't looked at it in 2 months, but I wanted you guys to kind of be a little updated on the latest 2017 guidelines for diffusing capacity. Okay, let's see. Let's see if it moves here. I have no disclosures. Okay. Okay, let's start off with terminology. Okay, diffusion describes the passive transfer of gas from the pulmonary alveoli to the capillary blood. Now, oops, wrong button. Go back here again. Okay, we use the term diffusing capacity in the United States. Here in Europe, they like to use the term transfer factor. They think they're more right than we are. Basically, either term is interchangeable, though, when you see that. When they use the term transfer factor, I can't get the light to show up. I think we need a new battery in this rascal, guys. But whenever they use transfer factor, the only difference is you may see different units. They use millimoles per minute or kilopascals, whatever. And but basically, there's a conversion factor for that I kind of wrote down here. Kind of irrelevant, different normal ranges, but it is the exact same measurement. Transfer factor and diffusing capacity, we're talking about the exact same thing. The guidelines used the term transfer factor. It was a combination of the ATS, European Respiratory Society, was just published in January of this year. The latest guide, a lot of changes in that compared to the previous ones from 2005. A little bit of history, actually, the measurement of diffusing capacity is Dr. Crow. I wish we had a better thing here. I can't get it to show up. Okay, well, I'll just use my finger. Okay, Dr. Kroll won a Nobel Prize in 1920 for basically the exact same principle for measuring diffusion as we use today. Same technology. He's actually given the credit for this, the Nobel Prize, because I kind of talked to some fellows about in past years here. This was actually the work of his wife, Marie. She was a young medical student at that time. He was somewhat infatuated with her, had a nice hot relationship going on, got married. He carried on her work. He won the Nobel Prize for it. She had 3 kids. Actually, all 3 of those kids, though, was a really good genetic pool because they all end up going on getting Nobel Prizes or laureates in their own right stuff also, tremendous researchers. The actual standardization of the technique that we use today was done by a guy named Ogilvy and actually in 1957. So what we do today really is not much different than what we did then. We use basically use a tracer gas of carbon monoxide during a breath hold to measure the alveolar concentration of CO, and we're going to go through that in a little more detail in just a minute here. Now, just to go back to a little basic physiology here before we get into some of the changes that are made here, I need you to understand what we're actually measuring when we measure diffusing capacity. Some basic pulmonary 101 physiology here. Okay, since my pointer doesn't work, I'm going to walk over here. Hopefully the mic will pick this up over here. I'll talk louder. Okay, we need to understand that the transfer... You're fine. Okay, okay. The transfer of gas, in this case we're talking about carbon monoxide, across the lung membrane, is proportional to the area, the whole surface area of the lung. Kind of makes sense. The bigger the surface area, the more transfer of carbon monoxide. It's also inversely related to the thickness. The thicker the membrane, the less gas that goes across. It's also related to what, this isn't diffusing capacity, this stands for the diffusivity. Okay, it's related to the solubility of the gas divided by the square root of the molecular weight. Okay, it's kind of interesting because those are individual properties of a gas. Carbon dioxide, oxygen, not too much different in weight. Yet carbon dioxide has 20 times greater diffusivity than oxygen does. So that's part of the dependent on how much gas is transferred, and plus it's also dependent on the pressure, the driving pressure. Obviously, if you have a greater concentration of gas over here, it's going to have a greater driving pressure pushing it across. Okay, so that's kind of the basic principle of how gas transfers across the membrane. Now, we cannot directly measure the area of the lung surface area or the thickness of the lung membrane or the diffusivity. So what we do is we take those 3 numbers and we call those the diffusing capacity. Okay, we combine them into one term because we can measure the amount of gas that transfers, and we know what our partial pressure is. We can actually determine that of the gas we use, like carbon monoxide, to calculate the diffusing capacity. Seems relatively simple, the principle. Okay, well, it starts out relatively simple, but we're going to make it a lot more difficult. Now, so what we do is basically, now we simply make that DL. So we simply take the DL now, and we say that's equal to the CO, the volume of gas that transfers across the membrane, divided by the driving pressure. And of course, since carbon monoxide in the air is 0, we can simply make this VCO, transferring the volume of gas going across, divided by the pressure of the gas, determines the diffusing capacity. Very simple principle. Okay. Well, here's where it starts getting a little more complicated, though. Because when we measure diffusing capacity, during that 10-second breath hold of that small concentration of carbon monoxide, as you're holding your breath, that concentration of carbon monoxide is decreasing, 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 but it's rapidly falling. It's not the same pressure driving it anymore. It's going down progressively. Okay, so basically what's happening is that the amount of gas that's diffusing across is related to the alveolar volume. The bigger the volume, the more gas is going to be diffusing. It's going to be related to the rate of transfer, how much carbon monoxide can transfer per second. But that's going to be a relationship that's going to be declining rapidly because you're holding your breath. Obviously, you're going to have a lot less carbon monoxide halfway through the breath hold, so there's less driving pressure pushing it through. Make sense? Okay. So, and then the barometric pressure, again, is going to be a moving target. From when we start at one point, the fraction of concentration we take at times actually barometric pressure, because we're not working with air, we're working with carbon monoxide, so it's a much smaller concentration on that. Okay, so that's not the actual equation yet, but these are the principles it's based on. We have to take into account these factors that we're starting with. Okay, so measuring this becomes problematic. Now, as I already said, as carbon monoxide diffuses in the capillaries, as the time increases, the carbon monoxide concentration is constantly decreasing, as is the driving pressure behind it, because it's being absorbed into the blood. Now, we know the relationship changes according to a natural logarithm of the starting fraction concentration of carbon monoxide based on the time factor as it's, the time goes along in a 10-second breath hold. Okay, well, how do we get that number? Well, that's where old Dr. Crow comes in handy and his wife Maria. Because they found out, where they got there in 1914, they actually described the decay of carbon monoxide in a human lung. It's kind of interesting because up till 1914, scientists thought that oxygen in the body was an actively transported process. It was something that required energy. It was actively transported across the membrane, that they didn't think it was a passive process. Okay, they thought it was a passive process and was related to actually a fraction of concentration at whatever time you're measuring at that was equal to whatever the starting concentration was to e to the minus k t, okay, exponent. Kind of complicated, but what K actually stands for is diffusion times the barometric pressure minus the water pressure, VA. Notice those are kind of familiar. That's the same equation we started with 2 slides ago. Okay, that's where that K comes from. So things start to fall into place here. I don't want to spend a lot of time understanding this. I want you to understand where these numbers kind of come from, though. They kind of explain in pretty good detail in the guidelines themselves. Okay, so basically what we do is we just kind of throw K back in the original equation we had before, and we come up with this. Okay, now this is a real mess. We're not going to memorize this, but the only reason this slide is here is I want to show you how, when we measure a diffusing capacity, we got to be measuring something. Okay? This shows you all the things that we are measuring. Okay? And I want to explain to you how we're measuring it. What are the things we're measuring? Okay? Now, we have to measure the alveolar volume. We don't want dead space, we've got to take that out. So how we measure the alveolar volume, that's when we have all these trace gases. What are the trace gases besides carbon monoxide? Anybody remember what the trace gas is we measure diffusion with? Measure the alveolar volume? Anybody know what that gas is? What is it?
Helium.
Methane. Helium is when we do nitrogen volumes, but you're close. One of the tests we use helium. Okay. But no, when we measure diffusion, we use methane. A very small concentration, 0.3% of methane. Okay. Now, again, I don't want you to know the details here, but I just want you to understand that a lot of these fractions, these trace concentrations, are trace gases of methane and things like that. I'm filling in for the guy that isn't here. This is not the lecture on the schedule. This is the diffusion guidelines. So if you don't want to hear diffusion guidelines, eat and you can go.
You know, I'm always happy to have you tell me how much I don't know, Zach. It's always refreshing.
All right. Okay. So anyway, so as I said, the alveolar volume is a pretty complicated equation and stuff here, but one of the points I wanted to make, though, is dead space. This is going to be important with the new guidelines. Dead space, we don't measure when we do diffusions. We do a calculation. Okay, that becomes important because what if you have somebody that has like a pneumonectomy? they're missing like half their airways in here. That's going to mess up your equation on it, okay? We came back to that logarithmic relationship that Dr. Kroll kind of spoke to his wife back in 1914. Well, as we have the fractional concentrations of the gases in here, basically the things, we have to figure out how to get the alveolar concentrations of carbon monoxide. That's the key component. In other words, when you take that first initial breath of 10 seconds during the diffusing capacity, you're inhaling a combination of carbon monoxide, very low concentration, and methane. Now what the problem is, though, is carbon monoxide is absorbed very, very rapidly. Okay? Methane isn't. So when you inhale, you hold your breath for 10 seconds, then you exhale again. The methane's not absorbed. So the methane's mixed in with the alveolar gas now. So when you exhale it, you can have and you get all your dead space out. At that end expiration, now you know what the concentration of the methane is. And knowing what you started with, you can back calculate what the actual alveolar volume is. By knowing that alveolar volume, you can actually now figure out what the carbon monoxide concentration is in the alveolar volume after it's mixed in there in the very beginning of the inspiration. Okay? Because it's going to be the same that the methane was. The methane's the same at the end of expiration also. So, as I said, I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but I want you to just kind of realize that this is how the computer calculates all these different numbers. And we're going to go through where these fractional concentrations come from now. Again, this is going to become important in the new guidelines. A couple things you need to understand during the diffusion maneuver. When you do your rotations, I want all you guys to have tests done on yourself. Read the 1 or 2 pages of one of the textbooks on diffusing and pulmonary textbooks so you at least have an understanding where it comes from. During the diffusion maneuver, same maneuver, this is measuring the volume, this is the concentration of gases. What you do is, the patient starts, you have him blow completely empty his lungs down to residual volume. This is residual volume, 0 volume now, okay? He's on a spirometer, basically. He does an inspiratory capacity maneuver fairly rapidly, gets up to full vital capacity. And then you hold your breath for 10 seconds against the valve. You don't want to keep a big negative pressure. You don't want to do a Mueller maneuver, a Valsalva. You want to just kind of take a deep breath and kind of hold there for 10 seconds. The gases are mixing and exchanging. And then what you do is, when you're all done, at the end of 10 seconds, then you breathe out. But hopefully down to residual volume. We're going to talk in a minute about how you know the quality of the test, because this line at the end should be the same point as that line we started. Residual volume. Okay? If it's up here, you didn't empty all the way. If it's way down here, it means you started too high over here. You didn't start residual volume. And we'll talk about some of the error factors that come into play you need to know about. Okay? Same maneuver down here. Now we're looking at the concentration of gases we're exhaling. Okay? What you're doing is you take your breath hold. Okay? These are the, basically, this is the percent scale of full expiration of the gases. So what you're doing is they're mixing in the alveoli. And when you breathe out, these are the tracer gases. You start with methane. You clear your dead space. Once you clear your dead space, you're at alveolar gases now. The methane kind of stays steady, okay, because it's not absorbed. Once you hit your alveolar, the alveolar gas, methane stays constant. Down here, as you clear your dead space, the carbon monoxide, you clear your dead space, it starts to go down. How come it's not horizontal like methane? Why is it going down? That's right, it's still being absorbed. Right, as you're blowing out, there's less and less in the alveolar gas because some of it's still being absorbed. Excellent, that's exactly right. Okay. Now, how we measure, actually, we do our actual measurements. The standardization that we use, okay, is Ogilvy, remember that's the guy we started in 1957. We actually use Jones and Meade, which is very, very similar with a couple little caveats to it. What we do is, to be standard in every test, we use our, remember the T, the time we hold our breath becomes very important. Do we do it at the beginning of inspiration? Do we do it at the end, you know, when we get to full capacity? When we start blowing out, there's like a couple seconds in there emptying your dead space. At what point that becomes important? So we're consistent in doing that. So what we do is we actually start our time measurement, our clock ticking, at 7/10 into the inspiratory phase to reach full capacity. Okay? And then when you do your sample gas collection, like maybe 2 liters of sample gas or 0.5, we'll talk about in a minute, but you take it halfway in between that sample gas collection. So from 7/10 into the inspiratory time, to halfway into sample gas collection. That way you know you're consistent in every single patient. Now, like I said, I apologize, I haven't looked at this in 2 months now. There's a quick fill-in, so I got to look at the slide myself here real quick. Now, the new guidelines, we don't have the technology to do this yet, but this is going to be coming down the road within a couple of years. Remember how I mentioned that we measure dead space, we do a calculation? We really don't have to do that. There's several different ways we can do it. If you remember your old physiology, there's what we call the Fowler's method of measuring dead space. We're measuring the tracer gases, okay? Kind of makes sense. Why can't we just simply know that when we're measuring the volume of gases that are coming out, we take halfway through that, and when the areas of different areas go between there, halfway between, we know that's the dead space. We can actually do calculations of that, and it's actually recommended we do that now on the actual tracers. Somebody with COPD, they give recommendations of how to do that. You're kind of the halfway point with the areas between the two things equal there. You kind of cleared your dead space. They're going to be incorporating that probably into the software and the equipment within a couple of years, but it's not there in most systems yet. That's one of the new changes instead of the calculation, and it will be more accurate when they do that compared to what we're doing now. People that have like bronchiectasis now, people that have lobectomies, people that have any kind of tracheal malacia, bronchiated, dilated airways, those calculations that we're using now, you can really, alter your alveolar volume, your calculations by as much as 10, 15, even 20%. Okay, now, what are some of the factors that affect diffusing capacity? Well, the volume of the lung itself, we talked about that in the original equations. The path length it has to go through, the thickness of the capillary membrane, airway closure, volume of hemoglobin. There's some of the structural things. There's a lot of functional things that can affect diffusion too. Levels of ventilation perfusion, the uniformity of the distribution of the ventilation perfusion, the composition of alveolar gases, diffusion characteristics of the membrane itself, concentration of binding properties of hemoglobin, the CO and oxygen tensions in the capillaries. Makes a lot of sense. People that are smokers have higher carboxyhemoglobin levels. There's going to be more back pressure, causing the diffusion having a harder time to travel into the blood itself. Okay, that can lower your diffusing capacity. There's 6 steps involved in diffusion. You can actually measure some of these steps in the laboratory, believe it or not. I had a lot of extra slides in there that I took out because I thought, oh my God, I could spend an hour on this. But basically, there's the bulk flow of CO into the airways and alveoli is the first step. There's the actual mixing of the CO in the ducts, the air sacs, and the alveoli. There's the transfer of the carbon monoxide across the alveolar membrane. There's the actual diffusion through the parenchyma and the plasma itself. Then there's the diffusion across the red cell membrane. Reactions of constituents of the blood itself. These can be measured in the laboratory. For a lot of studies, they break these down into 2 measurable components. And what I didn't want to get into in great detail, these are actually different steps of resistance to diffusion. As I said, you can actually measure, that's a whole other lecture, we may get into that one of our physiology talks down the road here. You can actually measure the resistance of different components of this. There's actually graphs and equations you can use to do that. Now, the new guidelines, when you guys get out in the real world and play doctor, there's a lot, the standards for diffusion are really incredibly complex. When they put these new guidelines out, they put questionnaires out like the top 20 developers of this equipment out there to say, we want to know what your standardization are. Do they meet these criteria? They gave them a checklist. They only heard back from like 3 or 4 of them. And even the ones they heard back from, I think, as I recall, there's only 2 of them that met almost all the criteria on there. So basically, this set of guidelines boils down to it's more of a wish list than what's actually happening right now. But this is what the goal is. But again, I'm not going to go through all of these, but the calibration things, the things they require, the rapid gas analyzers, it's pretty complicated on here. The steps, how fast they have to be able to analyze in milliseconds and things, not to memorize that. The calibrations that have to be done in diffusion, again, pretty complicated. We're actually doing all of this ourselves right now in our laboratory. It does take time to do this. We're going to talk about some of this individually on patient testing requirements here. But basically, you have to actually calibrate in between each patient diffusion effort as well. And sometimes a patient with COPD, that can take up to 4 or 5 minutes in between efforts. And so we'll go through a little bit of that also. But there's a lot of different types of calibrations that have to be done. They should be documented in the laboratory. We keep a notebook of this. They have to keep track of this. They have to date it. They have to time it. And I do check these periodically. If you ever want to see how it's set up, again, you guys set up your own labs. These are requirements. JACO often skips over these things because they don't understand it themselves, but every now and then you get a sharp person that comes in and knows about this, and he will ask for your logbooks and stuff to look at those. There's certain conditions that are going to affect diffusing capacity. Obviously, capillary blood volume. The more blood you have, the more red cells you have, the greater diffusing uptake there's going to be for carbon monoxide. Exercise can affect your diffusing capacity also. Greater blood flow through the lung, faster it goes through, it's going to pick up more carbon monoxide. Body position is important. If you're laying down, topping, you can have better ventilation, perfusion, distribution through the lungs. The hemoglobin affinity for carbon monoxide also can play a role in how it's going to uptake. The alveolar O2, that's an important one. Obviously, if you have a higher alveolar O2, you're going to have greater competition for the CO binding to the oxygen sites. Higher the oxygen in the alveoli, that's going to decrease your diffusing capacity. Okay? Becomes important. For example, CRAPO. One of the comments I often hear from young people when they have these meetings and stuff, there's several different predicted equations out there. CRAPO, one of the real popular ones a lot of people use. Well, remember, CRAPO was in Salt Lake City. What's the altitude there? It's like, what's about like 4,000, it's like 2/3 of a mile. It's not quite a mile high in Salt Lake City, but it's up there a ways. Okay, so a couple things are happening. Number one is your alveolar oxygen levels are a lot lower. So basically, your carbon monoxide is going to be, less competition. It's going to diffuse a lot easier. Second thing that's going to happen is in your big tanks of gases that you're using to inspire, the same concentrations at sea levels up at higher altitude. Greater driving pressure there because you're at a lower altitude up there. So CRAPO, guys your age at the normal diffusing capacity might be 30 or 29 to 30. If you're in Salt Lake City, it's going to be like 36. So CRAPOs are always like super hot. If you use this predicted, you're going to find all your patients at sea level. If you go there to try to use CRAPO, all your normal people are going to be about 70, 60, 70% predicted. So keep that in mind, who you choose, your altitude and stuff. Again, I mentioned carbon monoxide levels become important because carbon monoxide levels, if you're a smoker, your carbon monoxide levels are 7 or 8%. You're only using like a point-something% concentration of carbon monoxide in your diffusion measurement. There's a lot of back pressure preventing that diffusion from going through into your lung. It's going to lower your diffusing capacity. You need to adjust for that. Okay. Now, how do we perform the actual test itself? Well, you should not breathe oxygen for 10 minutes. Keep that in mind if you have a patient on oxygen, you want to do a diffusing capacity. Just don't take them off the oxygen, whip them in the lab, and hope you get lucky and get a good number. Make sure he's off for a little while and he's equilibrated. Okay? Patients should be instructed. Now, this is sometimes where we fall down when we get busy. Guidelines clearly state this. Patient should be carefully instructed. Maneuver should be demonstrated to the patient. I rarely see anybody do this. You should actually demonstrate to the patient. You should be in a comfortable position. If he's supine or exercising, you should document it. You should refrain from smoking on the day of the test. Most patients will lie to you about this, but we'll get back to how we can fix that in the new guidelines. Okay, carbon monoxide back pressure decreases diffusion. We talked about that already. That also decreases binding sites. We call that the anemia effect. Okay, not only is there back pressure in the blood from the decreasing diffusion going across there during the measurement, but also by the fact it's binding to the hemoglobin itself, you get like an anemia effect. It's binding up sites and taking that hemoglobin out of the picture. Corrections should be made in smokers, and we'll talk about how we do that. Recording time of last cigarette, or if high air pollution levels, that should be recorded on the report also. Again, we rarely have our people do that when we really should be doing that. Okay. Inspiratory maneuvers. Okay. Patients should start tidal breathing with mouthpiece and nose clips. Should be long enough, that tidal breathing, to make sure the patient is comfortable and there's no ear leaks. You just don't stick them on the mouthpiece and say, hey, take a deep breath. Okay? Diffusions are very finicky tests. You need to have high quality. You have the subject exhale unforced to residual volume. Okay? In COPD, you need to allow up to 12 seconds for total empty. Again, this is where we fall down a lot. Okay? I see the text telling somebody, oh, blow, blow, blow. They blow out, 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 out. You see the thing kind of curved down at the bottom? Take a deep breath in. Okay? As long as you can actually see on the machines when a patient's achieved zero airflow. You make that patient keep pushing until he gets there, and it can't be up to 12 seconds. Okay, again, this is one of the biggest errors when we see things happen here when we get rousing diffusion efforts. Submaximal IVC occurs more often in subject not allowed sufficient time to exhale to RV. That's the biggie. Okay? And then when a patient gets to residual volume, you connect them to his test gas and you inhale rapidly to TLC. Now, there's two reasons for submaximal inspiratory volume but still achieving a normal TLC. One is you have the suboptimal exhalation to residual volume. You just don't blow all your air out. Okay. The second way is you have suboptimal inhalation to less than total lung capacity. You get down to proper RV, you just don't suck in as deep as you can. This, number 2, has a greater effect on diffusion, though, than the former, because it's reducing your alveolar volume more so. And remember, we need to calculate that alveolar volume, do that really fancy equation I showed that's really complicated in that one slide. We're going to come back to in a minute, blow you away again. Okay, now since the 2005 guidelines, 2005 said we needed an IVC of 90% of the vital capacity as the lower limit of acceptability. Well, okay. I said that incorrectly. 2005, they said 85% was the acceptable range. You had to have an IVC at least 85% of your forced vital capacity, be a quality one. Well, they changed the standard on us again. They went back to 90% again, with a couple caveats on there that I'm going to show you. Okay. The inspiration that you take when you get down to RV, it should be a rapid inspiration. Okay, you don't sit there and dawdle, do it over like 10 seconds. Again, I've seen this problematic in some of the ones I've watched in the text. They just kind of say, okay, take a breath in now. No, it doesn't count. Got to be pretty quickly, because remember, you're assuming, diffusion calculations assume an instantaneous lung filling. So the faster you get there, the better it is. Okay. Slower filling decreases the time the lungs are at TLC, which decreases the CO uptake. Okay. And 85% of the IVC must be inhaled in less than 4 seconds. Sounds like a long time, but it really isn't if you try to do that on yourself. If the patient takes longer times, again, it should be recorded in the comments. Rarely see that happen. Okay, somebody that does, once you're at that full inspiration, somebody that does a Valsalva maneuver will decrease your diffusing capacity, because you're decreasing the blood flow in the lungs by that pressure that you're creating. A Mueller maneuver increases your diffusion. Okay, you don't want to be sucking really hard on that negative pressure, because you're increasing the blood flow into the lungs, which increases your diffusion measurement. Same principles. What disease causes that? Increased diffusion. Does the same effect as a Mueller maneuver.
Diffuse pulmonary.
No.
ABM.
No, asthma. Somebody in acute asthma. What they're doing is when they have obstructed airways, they're sucking really hard, creating a greater negative intrathoracic pressure, causing more blood to rush into the lungs, which increases diffusing capacity. So it's not at all unusual people in status asthmaticus or COPD exacerbations to have really markedly elevated diffusions artificially that'll come down when you fix them.
Dr. Morris, we're exhaling for 12 seconds without doing a Valsalva maneuver. I mean, it's really tough to exhale for 12 seconds.
What's that now?
You're exhaling for 12 seconds, and at the end of these 12 seconds during the test, we'll be pushing at the end, similar to...
Yeah, but you're falling with a really deep breath. But you're right, it can be difficult for some patients. But yeah, if you follow it, you want to do it till they have zero flow.
Yeah.
I'm not saying you do 12 seconds in everybody, but you may take up to 12 seconds in a bad patient. And I think you can see examples of that in spirometry. You see some patients blowing 25 to 30 seconds on there, they still have air coming out. But it is followed immediately by a breath hold. So the COPD patients usually don't have trouble with this as much as interstitial lung disease patients. They're the ones that really have trouble doing a breath hold more than anything else. Okay. Basically, when you hold your breath at TLC, your intrapulmonary pressure should be near atmospheric pressure, is the thing. And that's kind of hard to do when you're a really deep breath, kind of try to keep a neutral pressure there, not sucking, not blowing, get a pressure against that closed valve. Breath hold time must be around 10 seconds plus or minus 2 seconds. Okay, now when you do your expiratory maneuver, the calculation assumes instantaneous emptying. Okay, so the expiration must be smooth, not super forced, but quickly, without hesitation or interruption. Okay, it's not really passive, but it's not really forced either. It's like so. Okay, now the sample collection time is to occur no later than 4 seconds after you start blowing out. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. You continue blowing out to RV, and again, you may have to get all your air out to get into RV. It may take as long as it did to start with. It may take 12 seconds to get all your air out. Okay. Where the future is going, we're not there yet, but rapid gas analyzers that we're using now, what it's going to be coming to is to measure trace gases at residual volume instead of doing all these calculations of tracer gases at the end of dead space, it's going to make more sense to do that at residual volume to get more accurate measurements. I'm not going to go through the measurements on that because we're not at that technology yet, but that's where things are going to be going, and all those equations are in the new guidelines to say how that's going to be done. Now, some of the measurement errors that occur during your maneuver I have here. Now, this is actually doing the volume. This isn't the tracer gas. This is doing the actual vital capacity measurements during diffusion. Okay? Again, blue dots here for residual volume. If you're breathing in too slowly, it's going to give you a really low diffusion because when you're at these lower volumes, you're not absorbing as much carbon monoxide. Okay? Again, same problem, stepwise inhalation. You're not at total lung capacity. It's going to underestimate your diffusion. Basically, start exhaling too quickly. It's going to mess up your expiratory time, your calculations also. Some of the errors out of this end here, when you have exhale volume, then inhale volume means you didn't start at residual volume. More gas is coming out than when you start residual volume. That's not good. When you start here, residual volume, and you blow all your out, you're up here. You probably have gas leak someplace. So those are all important things. You actually have to look at the tracings to know what's going on if you have a problem. It's amazing how often these two show up on that. In the lab, when I'm here on Fridays, I'll sit down and go through maybe about a half dozen spot checks of the test the day before, and I'll probably still find maybe out of a half dozen tests, one or two that don't meet one of those criteria on that. They're common errors. When you actually look at the gas concentrations, when you start seeing jagged lines in the inspiratory thing here, it means you got leaks here. When you start seeing the tracing during the breath hold, it starts drifting down a little bit. It means you have a breath hold leak on there. These are things that actually are pretty easy to spot on the tracings themselves. Okay. When you actually do your sample collection, that's pretty tricky also because you have to make sure your dead space is clear. If you don't, diffusion is underestimated. Washout volume should be between 0.75 to 1 liter. In patients that have a vital capacity less than 2 liters, like in the bad COPDers, especially the ILD patients, they do allow you to collect a volume of only a half liter when you do your gas selection. Okay, graphical display is going to show you in a minute. It'll show you how you actually know the dead space is cleared that you're going to measure. Gas collection should occur at a point where the washout dead space is complete and the tracer gases just start to plateau. I'm going to show you what I mean here. Okay, the carbon monoxide ceases to rapidly fall, which means you've just cleared your dead space now, and it starts to smooth gradual decline. Remember, decline from what we already established here because you're still absorbing CO, so you want to kind of get it where it changes the slope on that. If your gas collection is too late, your diffusion's overestimated. Okay, now, a couple of things I want to show you here. Now, the guidelines tell us you always use the concentration versus the volume. Okay, this is the, make sure I have it correct here. Concentration graph on the left, volume on the right. Okay, you use the concentration graph to plot the dead space, to plot the end of the VD to collect your gas sample. And that's what the little gray bar is right here. Okay, put it on there, versus using the volume graph to do that. Okay, the computers will usually pick it out. One of the problems is, though, the technicians have the ability that they can move that around a little bit. You got to be careful, though, because what happens in this situation here, pretty similar here, tracing here. Well, let's say the operator manually tweaks a tracing using concentration versus the time clock. Okay, so I haven't looked at this in 2 months, so I got to make sure I understand it myself here now. Okay, and if you use get it to work again. Okay, if you use the volume here to clear it, it looks like you kind of got the same point here, where the slope is changing from the dead space. But here, if you just tweak it just a little bit, and then you look at the volume, see how much you missed it by on this. This is why you should be using the volume to mark it on there. So if you just try to tweak it a little bit on this one, it can be off by quite a bit here. And that's why they recommend you use the volume one in order to do that. Now, Most common gas we use for diffusion is we use a carbon monoxide concentration of 0.3%. Now, the oxygen concentration is 21%. A number of different studies out there using diffusion, different gases. You've got to be careful of the predictants that you use. Okay? Some studies use 17% oxygen. If you use 17% versus 21% that we use, that could increase your diffusion by 8 to 9%. Remember why? Why, if you use a lower oxygen concentration, does it raise your diffusion?
Less competition.
Exactly, less competition, because the partial pressure is higher here, more competition of oxygen for the same slots. Exactly, so less oxygen, diffusion is going to be higher, more carbon monoxide can whip across. Exactly right, excellent. Okay, some people use a tracer gas of helium, so there you're partially correct if we were 30 years ago. So you're right on that original answer you gave, actually. But we use helium for nitrogen, or for lung volume measurements also. Okay, so the bottom line is, though, you use tracer gases that are not absorbed and not normally present in the air, because it's important. That's how we use to calculate the alveolar volume. Is that tracer gas, as it goes in, and then it mixes with the alveoli, it comes out, it should be the same concentration going in as going out. Now, then we can calculate alveolar volume. Okay, and we use that tracer gas to back calculate what the actual carbon monoxide concentration was in the alveoli. Okay, whether you use methane or helium, it gives similar results for the diffusing capacity. The remainder of the mixture is using nitrogen. Now, on normal people, you need to allow 4 minutes between maneuvers. People with COPD may have to allow up to 10 minutes between maneuvers. Okay? You can speed up the process a little bit by taking several periodic deep breaths. Technology is rapidly advancing to the point now. The newer software, we have some of this, where you can actually, when you put the patient back on the mouthpiece, you can actually measure if there's any tracer gases left, like methane and things, that'll mess with the calculations. You can measure if that's cleared yet to determine if you can do your next diffusion maneuver. Okay? The tracer collection should be less than 2%. We're supposed to be doing that. Okay? When techs get rushed, sometimes they don't, they move on ahead to do that. But keep in mind, this is something that I've actually thought about. Maybe I should put extra things on the reports that the techs actually have to fill that out. What was the tracer gas at the end of that? You could probably lie. Terrible to say, but there's, it was 0 on that. So thought about things like that, but people kind of just move on from there. So I don't know what the right answer is here. But there are ways to measure that to determine if they can go on to the next maneuver. And again, if it's not that, it should be reported. Now, what the guidelines are recommending now with the new rapid gas analyzers and the new software in the next couple of years, we'll be showing that also, is to take out the tech component of that. They're actually going to have equations built in. So when there is tracer gas left in the alveoli, they will actually make the equations a little more complicated, calculating alveolar volume, taking into account what's already there. So in other words, they'll subtract that out of it and take that into account already. So there are ways the calculations become a lot more credible. They are in the guidelines, how to do that. We're not going to talk about, but there are ways to do that, and the software will be doing that within a couple of years. So there have been a lot of good quality control studies. The accuracy, they claim it's pretty accurate, but that may actually speed up our ability to do diffusing capacities a little more rapidly without having to wait like 10 minutes in COPDers and stuff like that between the efforts. Okay, kind of interesting that diffusion is a variable measurement throughout the day. There's diurnal variations. Okay, it can fall as much as 2.2% throughout the day from morning to night. Explanation's not really clear. It might be related to the fact everybody has a diurnal variation in hemoglobin. People's hemoglobin can vary significantly throughout the daytime also, due to volume effects. In females, there's a 13% decline in diffusion during the menstrual cycle. It's highest just before menses, it's lowest by the 3rd day. Not really sure if it's related to hemoglobin, if it's hormonal or pulmonary vascular tone. But again, that becomes significant. It's not unusual to see that in the laboratory also. And that's an average. Some are much more, some are much less. Alcohol decreases diffusion for reasons that are not entirely clear on that. People that come in, it's kind of, I've seen that, we all have alcoholic patients, you kind of smell the alcohol. It's kind of interesting. Pay attention to that sometimes. If you have spirometry diffusion, if you had a previous number, if you smell the alcohol, I bet you anything, your diffusion's a lot lower. That's something I've kind of seen coincidentally a lot over the years also, and then you just kind of have to blow it off and ignore it at that point. Sometimes it interferes with the analyzers also. Let's talk about the sequence, okay? Diffusion is often performed following albuterol, okay? There's always an argument, well, gee whiz, if you do diffusion after you give the bronchodilator, will that affect the value? Will the diffusion be higher or lower? There was a study a number of years ago, actually about 30 years ago, that said that if you do your diffusion after you give your bronchodilator, there's a 6% increase in diffusion. There's been several new studies now that show that really there's no effect in normals on that at all, or reversible or non-reversible airflow obstruction. So really whether you give the bronchodilator first or last, it doesn't really matter on that one. Okay, so basically what we do is we do the spirometry, we give a bronchodilator, we do the remainder of the test, and we go back and do the bronchodilator spirometry after that. The interesting question is, if you keep doing repetitive spirometries over and over again, is that like exercise? Because, exercise increases diffusion. If you do too many of those, can that increase diffusing capacity? That's still kind of an unanswered question. Keep in mind also, we used to do routine nitrogens, but sometimes when patients don't, it's amazing how you guys miss this on your PFT rotation, looking at PFTs and stuff. We do plethysmography, but when a patient can't get in the body box, we do a nitrogen, okay? Because they can't do it, there should be a comment there. It'll say FRC N2 instead of FRC pleth. That's how we get the lung volumes. When you do a nitrogen volume though, remember how we do that, okay? We do diffusion after that, normally. Okay, sometimes you do it after that. The order becomes important because if you give a patient 100% oxygen, okay, you're completely washing them out. It's going to take time for that to replete itself, okay? So what you should do is you really should do the nitrogen after the diffusion. Sometimes our people forget to do that, okay? So again, when you see that happen, it's something you need to think about because if the sequence becomes important because you washed everything out and then you put carbon monoxide in, you got a lot of competition for the oxygen. But using 100% oxygen without carbon monoxide, so that becomes important too. Now, as far as testing, guidelines say you must have 2 acceptable efforts that are within 2 millimeters per minute per millimeter mercury. 2005, they said that had to be within 3. So they've tightened it up quite a bit. 2's not very much, okay? Now, the mean of the acceptable maneuvers is what's reported. If you end up doing like 5 maneuvers, you're going to decrease somebody's diffusion by around 3.5%. And that's because of the accumulation of carbon monoxide. Okay? Now, quickly here, what's considered an acceptable diffusion effort? Again, they have some pretty strict criteria now that we're supposed to adhere to and report on the reports. I'm trying to figure out how we can do this here. This is going to cause kind of mutiny in the ranks if we get to this point. Okay, you're supposed to score it, A, B, C, and D. Okay, what every test theoretically should have is you have an inspiratory vital capacity that's 90% or greater of the forced vital capacity. You should have an inspiratory time hold of 8 to 12 seconds. You should have a sample collection time of less than or equal to 4 seconds, as you're blowing out. Okay, and ideally you should have 2 of those. Okay, they will allow you to have, still be a group A, if you get an 85% on one of the 2, but it's within, your alveolar volume is within 200 milliliters of the 90% effort. In other words, if you don't make the 90% on 2, but they're pretty close, you can call that still an A effort. Outside of that, they start, getting pretty, dropping pretty dramatically. Probably about 10 to 15% of our tests that we do actually are more B category, not A. Guidelines now tell us that greater than 90% of our tests should be in this category. We're not achieving that right now. We thought we had a big breakthrough back a few years ago when we started achieving basically almost 90% of our tests doing that, and then they moved the mark on us in this latest set of guidelines. When you get down to these lower categories, they shouldn't even be reported. You should just say on there, this is a grade whatever. Sometimes they report those. You've got to pay attention, again, the test, what happened during that. I think it's a pretty good indicator if you see the inspiratory vital capacity is 50% of the FVC. Pay attention to that. Okay, if 2 grade A maneuvers are not reportable, reports reflect this information. Okay, in other words, if you get 1 good effort, it's okay to accept it, but you need to put on the report you only had 1 effort. We do get some of those fairly often too when the tests get really busy. Sometimes they'll get 1 good one, they see it's a really good effort, it's pretty good, and they'll just kind of stop there and move on. It's okay to do that if that's the only good effort you have. They don't say, just do one effort, it's a good and you quit. And that's a little bit of caveat there. Okay. If no acceptable maneuvers are obtained, then report the average of the grade B, C, or D. If only grade Fs are obtained, no diffusion should be recorded with the comments indicating that. Okay, now here's some things that are changing in this guidelines also. Hemoglobin and carbon monoxide corrections now recommended to be made to predictive values. In the past, we always corrected the patient's values. We correct the patient's, diffusion for hemoglobin. Well, this is where it gets kind of interesting, because as soon as I read this, I'm on the phone with these guys. Come on, guys, let's get serious here, Put a call into McIntyre immediately. He's the guy that kind of wrote these down at Duke, and I said, come on now, let's get serious here. There's nobody's equipment in the world that does the calculations on the predicted values. And he says, I know. And so then I sent letters out to the Care Fusion people, the VMAX people, the Jaeger people. And I said, have you read these yet? And then basically they kind of said, yeah, we know that, basically they're having all these committee meetings and huddles saying, is there any way we can do this? And the bottom line is, does it really matter if you correct the predicted or the patients are correcting by the exact same amount? One you're correcting down, the other you're correcting up. And so I don't know what's going to happen to that, but I think the guys got a little bit carried away in the guidelines doing that.
Why do they do that?
They don't have a good reason. Basically there's no literature reference on it, and this was their committee opinion. There was like 6 guys on the committee. McIntyre was the only American on the committee this time, the rest were Europeans. But they had no good reason. They just thought it made more sense to them. They didn't say one. And like I said, when I wrote to him, he couldn't give me a good reason. They just thought it should be done. And the people at the companies that make this equipment, they have nowhere way they can incorporate it into their software at this point. They have to rewrite everything. They're going to throw maybe some switches in that allow you to do that if you want to. But it means all the page formatting, it's a major rewriting to do something like that. So I think that's going to change the next set of guidelines. It's going to piss off so many people because they just don't have a good reason for it yet. They can't back it up anymore. But then on the other hand, they say the barometric pressure corrections should be made on the patient's measurements, not on the predicted values. So when you correct the patient, the other correct the predicted. That makes no sense either. Because now we're doing just the opposite, we're correcting the predictions. We're also finding out that the past hemoglobin correction equations we're using, like Coates and things like that, they probably aren't all that accurate. Part of the reason is equations aren't that accurate, but the other reason is the hemoglobin normal values have changed in the population in the past 50 years since those original equations were done. So they also threw in some new equations of ways to correct hemoglobin for different predicted values at different ages and sexes, because again, hemoglobin varies according to sexes and ages and things like that. We just have one standard equation for everyone. So these are things that we got to figure out what to do. 2005 predicted authors back then kind of showed you all the different types of diffusion concentrations that were used. What they told you to do back then was try to find a gas mixture that kind of meets yours, but better yet, go out and collect yourself a bunch of normal patients and then plot them against all the different predicteds out there and find out which ones fit your population best. We ended up using Miller, though he used helium. We already pointed out that helium and methane pretty much, that doesn't change predicted values. He didn't actually say it was a balance of error, but I presume he probably did, because actually Miller was kind of interesting. His predicted values were actually obtained in the Ann Arbor area. Back about 30, 40 years ago, they had a big train wreck in the farming area and released all these noxious gases. So one of these big university honchos goes out there and collected hundreds and hundreds of people, all these people in the population, collected all these pulmonary function tests on them. And smokers, non-smokers, everything else, and they kind of used them as predicted values. Well, when I kind of plot them out against ours, that fit our population almost perfectly. When you look at the 95% confidence intervals, 19 out of 20 of our normal people fell right within that range. So that's why we've been using Miller's here. Now, since then now, those guidelines, there's some other predicted equations that have come out. I'm probably not going to use these for a number of reasons. For example, like Thompson, Australia, 45 to 71 years of age, so that eliminates half our population below the age of 45. Netherlands, pediatric people. Rio and Garcia, they're the age 65 to 85. Again, we leave out everybody that isn't retired. A bunch of pediatric ones here. These guys I got to look at. Michaelopoulos from Greece, 18 to 91 years of age, 200 patients. I'm going to have to get that reference and do some plotting out there, because that might fit our population pretty well. If it has, I might consider going to it, because they use the same gas mixtures that we do. This one, Burbanks, in Belgium. Not so sure, population's a lot smaller, but these are two I may kind of look at. The Global Lung Health Initiative is working on development. Are you guys familiar with who the Global Lung Health Initiative is? Heard that term before?
Yeah.
Yeah. It's important to know that because what they did with spirometry about a year and a half to 2 years ago, they got all the predicted authors together in the world that have done spirometry, and they accumulated them in one big meta-analysis. All the different races from around the world, blacks, Hispanics, everything else, they developed one set of regression equations for all of them. Okay, so that you can have one equation fits all, depending on what the race is. It means like a 0 to 1 to 2, the sex, the age, whatever. It's a move, it's a height, weight, all that other stuff. It's in one thing. We have those on our machine right now. I haven't converted over to those yet. Part of the reason I haven't is because right now we're using NHANES. I've plotted it out. A lot of other people have also. It's kind of interesting because that global initiative, the equations, the curves almost perfectly fit NHANES curves right now. Kind of makes sense they would though, because NHANES had about 50,000 patients and all the other studies had about 200. So it kind of makes sense that NHANES would dominate those equations also. So right now we're still using NHANES 3. We probably will for a while until I see something changes. But they're doing the same thing with the diffusing capacity now, the same initiative. They're collecting the data. That was part of the reason they set up the new set of guidelines, created them now to take into account some of that. I reviewed one of the papers on it, part of the ACCP network for physiology and PFT stuff. They've actually sent the manuscript to us in the last couple of months, that set of equations. They have us read the article. A lot of us rejected it just because it's too narrow in its focus in certain populations. It's not really a global thing at all, so they need to do more work on it. And that's the end. And that's the new guidelines, guys. Any questions? Yes?
When you have a DLCO of 18%, 20% of predicted, when